synthesize everything into a deeper understanding of narcissism as a post-traumatic condition. And to accomplish this, I use the concept of fantasy. Fantasy not only as a defense mechanism, but fantasy is an organizing principle. Fantasy is a narrative that rules the narcissist's life. Fantasy is an artificial environment, also known as paracosm, into which the narcissist tries to force other people to belong. He tries to introduce other people, coerce them into the fantasy. And so I recast narcissism as a post-traumatic condition that the solution was to give up on reality and to substitute for it with fantasy, and then to try to convert everyone to this new religion of fantasy and to make them members of the fantasy, figments of the fantasy. This is very similar to a cult. It's a cult approach, in effect. And I borrow heavily from cult psychology. I also borrow heavily from the psychology of religion. But suffice it to say that I consider narcissism as a form of religion. Think about it this way. The child is traumatized. So what or abused. So what the child tries to do, the child creates a god. The child creates a deity, a divinity. And this divinity, this god, this new god, is the false self. The false self is everything the child is not. The false self knows everything. It's all-knowing. It's omniscient. The false self is all-powerful, is omnipotent. The false self is perfect and brilliant. The false self is God. The child invents a primitive religion with a godhead, with a god figure. And then the child starts with human sacrifice. It's a pagan religion. Pagan. The child sacrifices first and foremost himself. It's a human sacrifice. The child sacrifices to the false self, the true self. And then the child goes, when the child becomes an adult, the child continues with human sacrifices. His intimate partners, his children, his friends, they're all sacrificed to the false self, like human sacrifice. It's a religion. That's why the narcissist keeps creating cults based on fantasy, sects.
Amazing.
This cult can have 2 people, the narcissist and his wife. This cult can have 40 million people, Donald Trump and his followers. So the cults, the size of the cult doesn't matter. The principles are identical. There's a fantasy, a central fantasy, and everyone is forced to belong to that fantasy, to conform to it. When you think of fantasy as the glue in the understanding of narcissism, suddenly everything fits, because the fantasy demands cathexis, emotional investment. So I unified everything in a new framework, which involves fantasy as the core. And everything I know about narcissism from all these schools, not only Freud and not only psychoanalytic and psychodynamic schools, and from, I once counted and I borrowed from well over 37 treatment modalities and dozens of schools of psychology to create the coherent theory of narcissism that I'm proposing. But one thing is important to understand. It's not a theory of narcissism. It's a theory of a new psychology, because narcissism is at the center and at the core of literally every known mental illness and every known mental process and every known mental trait. All psychology is founded on narcissism. As long as we define narcissism as a pathology or dysfunction or problem with cathexis and so on, we didn't see this. Narcissism. Psychotics and narcissists cannot tell the difference between internal objects and external objects. They cannot tell the difference between inside and outside, reality and fantasy. It can even, this work, what I'm doing, can even explain psychosis. I can explain everything with this simple, relatively simple principle. Mental illness is about renouncing reality and adopting fantasy, period. With this simple principle, I can explain everything.